compatriots from Mexico. Jorge, Alfredo, good to see you. Both of them are lawyers. They're experts on privacy and security. And I wanted to do something differently, to play musical chairs here, to have a more interactive session before lunch so we could be more interactive. And if there are questions or comments during their presentation, I could pitch in and intervene with the audience. Greetings from Adrian, that is here. Great to see you here. We have a large audience in the room from across Latin America with a high percentage of Brazilians and people from Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, the United States, Guatemala, Chile, Honduras, Argentina, Mexico, India, Mexico, Chile, your way. If you show me the map, yes, it's going to be your way. So we have a very diverse group, questions from the audience that are very, very good. So let me welcome you and thank you for being here. Thank you, Olga. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor to be here in this space when it's up to us to deal with privacy, data protection, and social media. Before we delve into this topic, because I have a fellow panel that is a master in these topics as one of the best experts in the field. Thank you, Alfredo, for being here. I would like to tell you a few stories before asking basic questions that I believe it could become very relevant. And I would like to share a story dating back to 1999. And I'm going to tell you why. In December of 99, I was in Chiapas, Potosí, the border with Guatemala, doing some work with the Aboriginous peoples, Sijitos and Jolabais in Chiapas. To my surprise, where I had to take pictures. They are called brothers, where we had to take pictures of these Aboriginous peoples. They told me no, because when taking a picture, you're going to steal my soul, rob my soul, so you cannot take a picture of me. So at first, it really called my attention. I didn't understand what they meant. But after 20 years or 5 years, I know that they are right. Back then, digital cameras were not popular. Smartphones basically process SMS. They were not smartphones, they were cell phones. And it was very rudimentary, the technology. A smartphone was inconceivable at that time, unheard of. And right now, we had the habits of browsing, preferences, political, ideological, sexual preferences, idiosyncrasies, the possibility of interacting with different communities based on a cell phone. Imagine social media statistics. Cell phone profiles allow us to identify or pinpoint or profiling individuals perfectly well. And this should also be deployed to the behavior acts, system of beliefs, heritage, family relations, and social life. And it's not a minor thing. When speaking of this, Alfredo, I'm sure, is going to delve on this, on the self determination in IT. And this is a clear example of an utopia that is very difficult to attain. You have regulatory frameworks, guarantees like the ones we see in the European Union, with a data protection regime that has a scope that is outside the territory of the EU, where we have the individual front and center with a robust protection, and especially with institutional issues or aspects for data protection, like the post war period in Europe in connection with data privacy invasion or infringement or acts of war using private information, personal information, was used for war purposes. And then we have a free market sectorial model, like in the case of the United States, is where we find most of the large IT multinationals by the sectorial legal framework, tending to cross-border transmission of data, placing priority on trade rather than individual guarantees. And then we will find a third model in places like China, Korea, North Korea, where it's obvious that on the part of the state there's an absolute control of personal information of their inhabitants. And given this context, based on the data protection, personal data protection regimes or schemes that are in effect, our countries have different legislations among these models. And finally, this is taking us to having a less uniform perspective at the regional level, and probably Alfredo can explain this and can take this question. So I will ask him a question now that I will bring to the forum. Alfredo, what is personal data? Could you share your view? And if possible, what is the regional perspective that we're having on the definition of personal data? Excellent, Jorge. It may seem a basic definition, maybe basic at first, but eventually it's very deep because we're talking about a subjective fundamental right of third generation. So, what is personal data? Personal data can be seen as all information relative to a physical individual identified or to identified. By definition, we're speaking of is we are speaking of information relative to the profile of person as long as the person is identified or can be identified is in a way. And that is why we can draw some examples. A drop of blood, for example, that blood in the room where we are right now, is it personal data? Can we open the floor for this question? Is a drop of blood personal data? It's going to be personal data as long as that information we could target the identity of a person. When? the blood drop embeds the DNA, there's not a public registry or a registry of public domain of that DNA. And as of this DNA, I can identify a special individual that could be considered personal data. And there are many special cases like bones, hair, the mothers, the mothers trying to find the disappeared ones, their children that had disappeared in the dictatorships. Who are las muertas de Juárez, for example, is it's a very sensitive issue. Yeah, probably you're not aware of. In the north of Mexico, in Chihuahua, they kidnap and they kill sometimes women. So there's a group of mothers that are looking for the bodies of their daughters. So that's why we call them seeking mothers, madres buscadoras, and they don't have public sector support or the support from the political spheres to look for their daughters. And that is why the remains that they could find could be personal data. Imagine to the extent that these mothers got because they got blood tests that could be identified or relate through DNA that remains of what they find buried. And they could correlate that to a family or related to forensic science or genetics and compared to that of relatives. There remains that could be identified uniquely a person, like a tooth, bone, hair, that could be easily identify an individual. So this gives us an idea. In the case of an IP address, an IP address could be personal data as well. Just like the drop of blood, it's not yes or no. It depends. In the drop of blood, it would be personal data as long as I have a registrar of DNA, like in the case of those mothers, what I could find the file of other drops of blood that could identify individuals. But in the case of IP addresses, first, it's a unique number relating a piece of equipment over the network to a person. But let's assume that that equipment is used solely by one person and that the IP address is a fixed IP address and that fixed IP address was hired by an individual and the only user or unique user of that equipment is an individual. In that case would be personal data. If not, there's no way of relating that to the individual. Let me tell you how these topics are coming up in connection with artificial intelligence. And I will ask you especially if, under your opinion, an avatar is personal data, like in the case of gamers that they use avatars and they use patterns of blinking. So these topics How can we protect this personal data? This is very interesting. Speaking of avatars, and if there's a way where we can relate that avatar with an individual, of course, it would be a personal data.
Una cosa también. En el,
In the case of finance.
la
In the case of finance, is possible to identify biometrics, and that biometrics identifies as a financial institution. And then, second, the way you talk, the way your rate, speech rate, the way you modulate presupposes biometrics. And biometric as such relates that to an individual.
importante
That's why the definition that seems silly is so important. It's very complex. If through these patterns, this model of blinking or that voice recognition or heart rate or the way I am using the keyboard in a computer is going to help identify a person, of course, it's going to be personal data. And in terms of legislation, should be protected. Let me also, Alfredo, define a little bit this. The legal definition adopted by several countries, specifically Mexico, Argentina, we mainly talk about physical persons, but why don't we open this also to moral persons? I believe that there is jurisprudence in Mexico, for example, in which the protection to the right for privacy is established not only for companies but also for moral persons. And so why should this be excluded if moral persons are subjected as well to those rights and obligations? Here, there's some academic debate that is quite important. A moral person is going to have personal data. Those are people. It's a moral person. It's like a child that doesn't resemble its parents. It has its own identity. So, who is going to be protecting moral people? Intellectual property, industrial property, trade secrets. There are some protections in place which are not necessarily the same, but there are some legislation in South America which also take moral people as personal data. Those legislation following the Mexican model won't include it even in the definition. Notice that the definition is quite clear. Any information regarding a physical person that is identified or can be identified. There are some references and some jurisprudence on some kind of information as regards a company, but in formal terms, taking into account the law, at least in Mexico, it cannot consider as personal data. It could be included. There would be no limitations in that case. This is kind of a more positive limitation. I don't know if you understand me. What do you mean more positive than neutral? Natural rights. The positive would be from the Javier Arbat model, which is in excluded because it belongs to human beings, so you can consider human being a company, for example. Is it possible? No, it's a group of human beings with a defined social goal, with some limitations, some bylaws, and their set structure, but it is actually a group of people with a common goal. So I have a question here. I believe that we can discuss about this, and especially as the definition of the law, this should be excluded, but we can also consider some of the interpretations by some courts, which sometimes include moral people into this. So it has to do maybe with the legal context of each country. Yes, that is very clear. And there are personal data for moral people, but remember that courts are going to be interpreting the legislation, and if we have some specific legislation talking about physical persons and excluding moral persons in a written way, in that case there is no interpretation. So we can go a little bit beyond the rules, but I believe that there may be a possibility to advocate this. Is there some kind of element that was affected by this provision? Not necessarily so. Maybe that is the way we are following, but I believe that in Mexico, and talking specifically about Mexico, it won't be right to consider personal data for moral persons. In some other countries in South America, that is considered as such, and we, of course, respect that. Let me ask you, in that sense, we are talking about personal data and the value of personal data. We have mentioned that personal data are like the new oil, because as we know, oil is not a clean fuel. But let's talk a little bit about the value of this personal data in social media, specifically in AI apps, in the metaverse. Which is the value, or how is this value of personal data determined there? Well, that is kind of the important point in this question. That's why I enjoy talking to you, Jorge, because you are so smart. And of course, it's a challenge. Personal data, the connection of personal data is one of the most valuable assets for any organization. That's why it's like the black gold or the oil of the current trade activities. Consider, for example, Walmart. Studied all the sale tickets from their shops. So for a year, in all its shops, they started reviewing all the bills or the tickets of buyers to check and to have an idea of which were the preferences and the needs of consumers, among other things. And they got great information regarding data. People buy, for example, diapers, also buy beer. all of us who are parents totally understand this, because sometimes with a baby and have to wake up every 2 hours, you may want a beer to relax. So what did they do? They put in a point in the shop diapers, and on the other way beer, because maybe in the way going from the diapers to the beer section they start putting other things to buy other products. So imagine that this was focused on the distribution of products within the store, the way in which those products were going to be located in the shelves. This has a specific reason, so everything is consumption oriented. For example, child's products are located in the lower shelves. Everything has a reason to be. The most expensive products are within your eyes line. The cheaper products are in the back. Everything is consumption oriented. So we are going to be doing a very simple exercise. Imagine how much is Coca-Cola, the company. What is the net worth of the company? Millions, billions of dollars. And what is the value of the building or the structure? A lot less. So what's the difference? The customers. So imagine the value that those preferences of consumers gives a company, satisfying that need. It's really important. But within this context, maybe it's not necessarily positive, but I was talking about the way in which I'm going to position my customers, but that also depends on the data, on the type of data, and the market as well. For example, it's not the same to have email base which is 200 Mexican pesos in the black market than a clinical file, a full clinical file, which is 200,000 or 500,000 Mexican pesos in the black market. I am talking about the list of electors, which now is quite common because we are going to be having elections in the city of Mexico. Everything has a different value. Another example as regards the value of data, of information, that information which is processed and classified is going to bring about AI. That is to say, from just a simple piece of information, I can get intelligence, artificial intelligence, and that is going to offer an added value within the organization. So that way of connecting that, maybe if I want to sell, for example, cigarettes, I'm going to take a customer base from the directory line of a specific city, for example. How many emails do I need to send? Which is going to be the work that I'm going to have to do to send a whole community those emails? How many answers am I going to get? Which is going to be the kind of efforts that I'm going to be making? If I had a segmented database in which only people who smoke are included, I'm going to have a better answer with less effort. So that's why this is so important. Another example, in Mexico, it is not forbidden to sell databases. You can buy a database, and that is legal, only if you have authorization by the owner. if the owner of that database authorizes me to sell this database to a third party, I can do it. And if I buy those databases, that information, I'm going to be gathering information, but I'm going to also take accountability and I'm going to comply with the obligations, the same obligations than the person who developed that database originally. So if I buy databases, I should assume all the obligations that are included in the privacy notice of each seller. So in that sense, let me ask you another thing. You are mentioning something important here, I believe. So companies are transparent as regards personal data processing. Is there really a possibility of tracking this consent in order to practice this idea of self-determination, or to see who I'm going to share this data with, which is going to be the goal? And in the context of free rides that technological companies are offering, we have been criticizing this a while ago, and I remember when you told me that sometimes free services end up being end up being the price of these services. You mentioned that, and why do you think it's relevant in the context of social media and privacy? Alfredo, Jorge. I know that it's early in Mexico, but here we have lunch in a few minutes, and I wanted to have the opportunity for the students to ask questions. There are like a lot of hands raised here, so I'm going to offer the microphone to the Mexican people first. Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Alfonso. Alfredo, I'm sorry, Alfredo. I'm Alejandro Baltazar from the Legal Sciences Institute in Oaxaca, and my question has to do with neuro rights, which is becoming more relevant, and it is like a new scope for rights protection. How are we going to protect citizens in a system which has massive extraction of personal data as an engine? I understand that we can see that it's not the same for an industrial capitalism which we are used to, but in this case, business models are migrating to have as a main pillar the idea that the models would allow them to gather customers' data, not only the customers, but also the raw materials. So how do we help them, or how do we help to avoid abuses to privacy rights from this point of view? Alejandro, this has to do with the question that Jorge just asked. It's kind of the same question, actually. The private sector is transparent as regards the processing of our data. You were talking about neuro rights, Facebook, social media. Depending on our preferences, we are going to have different profiles, and those profiles somehow are sold, processed, integrated, and I have the possibility to ask Facebook which information related to my profile have they developed. It's not that they are going to develop an individual profile, but what they do is to create a profile of a certain community, for example. Remember that we said that Trump had won because his speeches were kind of modified according to what was established in the requirements of the community. So in that sense, they mentioned different ideas for those speeches, and in that way, they had a lot more influence in the communities. So these neural rights are a clear idea that on the part of the private sector that is not transparent. We are missing a lot of culture in that sense. So if you ask yourself, are you really the architect of the way you are exploring the web? Are you aware of the digital footprint? Everything that you check on on social network, is it transparent? One thing is information that I'm going to share that is developed through the process that I am developing or that comes from third parties, but actually taking into account, as you were saying, Alejandro, neural rights, it goes beyond this. What do you think, Jorge? I believe that Alejandra was very accurate in the sense that we are like using raw materials, because here there's kind of a lack of humanity in that sense, because our searching habits or exploring habits have kind of interconnectivity. And here the question is, are there legal possibilities to have certain clarity as regards this context of my personal data and the scope of those data in cyberspace and that profile of my information? I believe the answer is no. And of course, I see that this is quite a complex issue. And it's difficult also to leave this for self-regulation. Actually, what they do is to create a global profile. It's not an individual profile, consistent with the ideas of what is being developed in a certain group. So this goes beyond that. It has an influence capacity that is quite important, and it may have a destructive capacity as well. And also, in that sense, Alejandro, I believe there is something quite important, which is the fact of information biases that are developed by receiving information through social media, which actually have an influence in that trend for searching. And there are also some like information islands in which you are going to receive information in connection to your intellectual preferences, your ideas. And it's very interesting because the information that Alfredo is going to receive through his social media and the one that you are going to receive, Alejandro, is going to be totally different. And it may be actually the opposite information from the reality that we see through social media. There's a cognitive bias which is paramount, and we should look for the different mechanisms to reduce that phenomenon so that all of us who are in this virtual classroom have the possibility of having this variety of information, which is actually a human right. This is quite biased and has the possibility of having a negative influence in modeling these habits and preferences online. There's another question, Alfredo. Is it working? Yes. I'm Mariana from Brazil. The scope of my investigation has to do with children rights and teenagers' rights online. And from the perspective of data protection, I have a question as regards the consent and how consent is going to be a tool for self-determination as regards information. The Brazilian legislation indicates that they should be informed, but we do not have transparency in platforms as regards children and teenagers. What is Mexico doing to protect this group of people as regards personal data protection? In Mexico, the person responsible for that children that are underage are going to be responsible to authorize that, to give consent. So you can only access this social media if you are of certain age. But there is no objective limitation so that a child that is underage would get into the social network saying that they are older. So in Mexico, what we tried to do was to get consent from parents. But from the objective point of view, it has not been so effective because underage children, in order to avoid getting consent from their parents, inform the social network or the website that they are older than they are. In other countries, there are some questions that have to do with getting some kind of reference, for example, in websites of selling alcoholic beverages. For example, in order to access the site, you have to answer which was the year in which you were born, or some way so that the service provider can determine if those children have the age in order to be able to access that content or not. The way in which we tried to solve this in Mexico was through the parents' consent. There's another question here. There's like a lot of questions. You are very popular here. There are a lot of online questions as well. So we're going to have one more question here in the room, and then we are going to answer some online questions. And then in 15 minutes, we are going to be rounding up because we have lunch waiting for us. Alfredo, Pablo Magaña from San Luis Potosí. Such a pleasure, Pablo. Pablo is very well known in San Luis Potosí and in Mexico. And he's a great friend and a great person. We didn't know about that. As regards moral or legal entities in Mexico, in terms of data protection, it's very interesting to see the definition of the law, of the federal law for data protection. Maybe in the private or public sector. And in that sense, it's quite interesting because in that sense, we would be losing that because most people in most countries require this, the idea of being mandatory to give that so that there is no problem with creditors. So we have public records. And here we have a state which is Nayarit that is removing this advertisement principle. So maybe we can consider the personal data not as a physical person, but as a legal entity that is going to be forced to offer this kind of protection because the state is going to protect the data from these partners. And We are also doing this in order to avoid money laundering. So we want to benefit the individuals. Yes, you are totally right. We are also talking about the fact that this is an individual warranty which is established in the Article 16th of the Constitution. We can say that individual warranties are also part of this group. And in that sense, we may not have problems. And finally, that could be solved with transparency. But this is something that has had a lot of debate and discussions, but it's actually a very good question. Another question, also from Mexico, from Infotech. As regards data or personal data, when the authorities have those personal data, which are the risks? For example, as regards national identity, which may be focus on a single agency, and which is going to be the use that is going to be given to those personal data. For example, in Mexico with cell phone numbers registry, that we had a problem. Yes, it's a very interesting topic because in Mexico we have specific regulations. In Mexico, personal data, which some specific people have, are following federal regulations. It's the same regulation for the whole Republic of Mexico. But personal data in the hands of authorities, for example, are going to be following a legal global base, but with some specific regulations in each state in the country. So there may be some specific differences in different states, even when the base is the same. There are regulations, and of course those are personal data, and of course that the public agency, public organization should protect and in the terms indicated in the legislation, they should protect those data. Legislation is quite specific. The public agency is not going to be the one that is going to be penalized, but the public official is the one that is going to receive the blame here. The penalty, the money that they should pay is going to come from the person itself, not from the agency in the public sector or the government agency. So in that sense, what we are looking for is actually to protect the ownership's rights. So as regards the way in which that list of all the electors in Mexico was quite strange, quite particular. Remember that there was some kind of procedure in which a company was hired to clean the database, and it was not normalized, so a company was hired to clean that database from the Elections Institute. And the way in which that is done is simply, if you live in a certain street, for example, maybe they mention that street, for example, Cerrada de Cortés. Maybe it's called Cerrada, maybe CD, maybe only Cortés. So the way in which they do it was to make those registries uniform, and apparently the government agency didn't pay, and that company kept a copy of the database, and then they sold it, and So those processing the information were the ones that were punished following the legislation. But that information had already been sold and was already in the hands of everybody in the country. So it was not something good. It was actually a tool that was used so that the consular service of another country could have information of Mexican cities. I don't know if it's true, but it is what we were told. We have only a few minutes and we have to have the lunch break, so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes each to round up the presentation. We don't have time for all the questions that we have. Someday we're going to organize a whole day to talk about this. So a couple of minutes for your final comments. And first, a round of applause for Alfredo. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Olga. Please, Jorge, your comments first. Thank you, Alfredo. It's a great pleasure to share this presentation with you. It's a great pleasure since 2009, which was the first school in Argentina that we participated until today. It's been a great experience, and I want to congratulate Olga and Adrián and Alfredo for sharing this kind of presentations. And finally, I want to mention that we are going to have huge challenges in the future, and we need to consider the context of AI in the federal and local environment in Mexico. We have had 300 initiatives of bills as regards AI, so we need to look for best practices. Privacy AI are going to be something that is going to open a lot of new horizons and a lot of new legal challenges, and we need to consider this. And I want to thank for the opportunity of sharing this presentation with you, and I want to offer a great lunch. And now I'm going to give the floor to Alfredo. Thank you, Jorge, and I want to also thank you for the opportunity. Those 300 initiatives that Jorge was mentioning have to do with a lot of legislation. Our legislators or lawmakers want to talk a lot about passing different laws as regards AI, but it's actually quite sad because it should not be regulated without considering certain things. So nowadays we are working on global models, like, for example, the global model of the General Regulation for Data Protection, Personal Data Protection, which in Europe is globally applied, or the different provisions as regards ethics, or provisions as regards risk management. I believe that we should follow that road, and that we should avoid the so much talk and to regulate maybe the technological part, but maybe sometimes lawmakers only have good wishes, but that's it. So we need to be careful, specifically in the case in which we are trying to foster this kind of topics so that this can be regulated in a convenient way. And you here in the South School on Internet Governance, which are the future for the Internet in the world, have these topics very clear in your minds and take into account that in Mexico you have two friends that with great pleasure are here to help you. So thank you so much, Olga. Thank you, Adrián, for the opportunity of doing this presentation, and have a great lunch. The students are asking if we can share your email addresses so that they can maybe ask some questions through email. Yes, of course, we are going to answer all your questions, and we are going to share through your WhatsApp, Olga, a presentation that I believe is going to help them in the to have a benchmark, an academic traditional benchmark, so that they can have some extra information which mentions some different textbooks and some different legislation that can be interesting for you. Another round of applause. Thank you so much. And have a great lunch. It was a pleasure to see you online, but I hope to see you face to face very soon. Thank you all. Thanks for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for all the questions, but you can send them emails. We are going to have lunch, and 2:30 we're going to resume with the afternoon session. Thank you.